Well, this morning as we give our attention to the study of God's Word, I want to invite you to take your Bibles together with me and turn to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. One of the things that we have talked about since we began the study of this book is that Daniel is about the sovereignty of God. It really presents God's sovereignty over all the circumstances, not just of the life of His people and of the nation of Israel, but over all of creation and all the nations. It demonstrates very clearly, particularly by the time we get to the end of the book, that God is sovereign over all of history, and He has a grand plan for redemptive history, that He is taking the world into that direction that is going to culminate at the time when the Son of Man comes back and establishes His kingdom. It's going to talk about the place that Israel has in that kingdom before we get to the end of the book. But in the meantime, we begin in Daniel chapter 1 with the declaration that it's in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And why is it that he is able to compel Jehoiakim to become a subject king beneath him? A Gentile ruler is able to come into Israel and compel the king of Judah to become his client king, a subordinate king to him. Well, the answer is given in Daniel 1 and verse 2. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. The reason that Judah becomes subject to a Gentile nation in 605 BC is not because God could not preserve His people, but rather because God, as an act of judgment to His people, subjected them to Gentile domination and authority. Ultimately, this is going to play out from 605 to 586 BC. It's going to play out where Nebuchadnezzar, as a result of a couple of rebellions by Judah, is going to come in and actually level the city and destroy the temple. And all of the Jews are going to be hauled off into captivity in Babylon. Now, that is ultimately because God is judging His people. And He is using a Gentile empire to do that. This begins the time of the Gentiles. In Daniel chapter 1, we see that this includes some of the vessels of the house of God being taken to the land of Shinar, that is, to the house of Nebuchadnezzar's God there in Babylon. He puts some of the vessels that come right out of the temple of God, he puts them into the pagan temple of his own deity there in Babylon. Why is it that he lets Nebuchadnezzar pillage the temple of God? Again, as a judgment against the people of Israel, against the Jews, because they have committed themselves to idolatry and to ignoring Him. Now, in this same context, you see that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are four individuals, somewhere in the ages of 13 to maybe as old as 15, are hauled off into captivity in Babylon. Not because they've done anything wrong, not because they have been particularly wicked or evil themselves, but rather they are caught up in the judgment of God and Him disciplining His people. And these young men are hauled off into captivity in Babylon in 605 BC in order to be in exactly the right place for them to be able to glorify God in that pagan context. In fact, we saw in Daniel chapter 1 that what happens is they are hauled off along with probably upwards of 60 to 100 other young men in the ages of 13 to about 16, hauled off into captivity, like was typical in foreign nations. When a conquering king comes in, the bigger he makes his empire, the more likely he is to need people who speak those native languages to oversee those provinces for him. So what is common in those days for the Babylonians to roll into Judah and take some of the nobility and some of the higher ranking families' youths, young men that are in that age where they're ready to go and be trained as adults, to be hauled off into the capital city of the foreign land to be trained up to be administrators in the government. And as the empire continues to expand, then you already have people that are natives to those lands now that you own and govern and rule, to send them there to exercise authority for you. Daniel and his three friends are included in this kind of a haul off into captivity. One of the things that really unique about Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and in particular Daniel is their commitment to be faithful to God even in captivity. This is a rarity. In fact, one of the things we're going to see in Daniel 3 when we get into it this morning is that there are a bunch of Jews that are on the plains of Dura that bow down to the idol that Nebuchadnezzar sets up, just like everybody else does. See, Daniel and his three friends are unique. They're committed to God no matter what. They're going to be faithful to God no matter what it costs them. They're going to be faithful to God, and they are faithful to God even as they are hauled off into captivity to begin with. They're committed to adhering to the dietary laws that are prescribed in the books of Moses. And God orchestrates the circumstances to preserve them in their faith and faithfulness to Him in Daniel chapter 1. And you'll recall that at the end, God has even blessed them to the extent that when they go through their final exams, so to speak, they shine above all the rest of the candidates. And that, in part, because they were so committed to being God's people, even in a foreign land. When you get to Daniel chapter 2, you see how God sovereignly gives this dream that for Nebuchadnezzar becomes a nightmare. He keeps having this recurrent dream over and over and over again. And it bothers him so much, this dream that God is giving to him, that he comes up with this absolutely ridiculous expectation of his wise men that they must tell him the dream that he's having in order to be able to then give him the interpretation, because that's the only way he's sure he can trust that when they give him the interpretation, that they actually are giving him the right interpretation, that this dream bothers him so much. Where do you think the dream came from? God gave it to him. Why did God give it to him? To facilitate not only Nebuchadnezzar learning that God is sovereign over him and over all nations, but also in order to have Daniel and his three friends elevated into positions of authority there in that foreign empire of Babylon. Well, you remember when we went through Daniel chapter 2, what we saw. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it so bothers him that he threatens to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And it's in that context Daniel demonstrates what great faith really looks like. Because he goes into the king and he says, "O king, give me time and I will tell you the interpretation." And when he goes out, he asks Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to pray with him. And the four of them pray, and God gives to Daniel not only the revelation of the dream itself, but of the interpretation. And you remember what the interpretation was? That God is in control of history, and He is in control of every ruler and of all the nations, and He has a direction to which He is taking history. And that is ultimately the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar, and I can tell you what the next empires are going to be, and he walks through them, but the consummation is going to be a stone that is not cut with hands. This is going to be something God Himself is going to do, and it's going to come and crush all the nations of men. God has a plan, Nebuchadnezzar. You're the head of gold, but God has a plan. I can tell you what the nations that are going to be that follow you are going to be like, but God has a plan. And when Daniel is able to tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream and then give the interpretation, the king is so thrilled that he elevates Daniel to his own unique position. Notice Daniel chapter 2, the last verse. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 49, well, actually, verse 48, the king promotes Daniel and gives him many great gifts and made him rule over all the whole province of Babylon. And not only the highest ranking muckety-muck there in the city of Babylon over the main province, but he also creates a special position in his cabinet called prefect over all of the wise men of Babylon. You're now in charge of all the wise men. So that's Daniel's special position. He is the ruler over the whole province, stationed there in the capital city, and he is personally put in charge of all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, over the administration of the province of Babylon while Daniel was at the king's court. So you notice, Daniel is a specific court official there in the capital city. But he's placed over the province of Babylon, and so he takes his three friends and asks the king to appoint them to be the rulers over the various aspects of the province. This, by the way, sets the tone for why Daniel will not be there in Daniel chapter 3 when they go out to the plains of Dura and the statue's set up. Because Daniel's actually part of the king's cabinet. He's in the capital. And even though he's responsible for the province of Babylon, it's his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or their Jewish names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's what has them in authority there. So now we come to Daniel chapter 3. And what do we see in Daniel chapter 3? Well, most of you are probably very familiar with this passage. And maybe even some of you young ones are familiar with Rakshak and Benny and the one of my favorite Veggie Tales. This is the story. This is the account from the Bible of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and what their faith looks like on display. What you're going to see here as we walk through Daniel chapter 3 very clearly is great faith in action. If you're looking for a title for this morning's message, that's it. Great faith in action. This is God in His sovereignty, orchestrating the circumstances of history in order to put real faith on display in a secular context. This is what real faith looks like. This is what those who really love God and are really committed to God, this is what their faith looks like in a secular world, in a pagan, fallen world. You saw Daniel and his three friends and their commitment to be obedient to the law of God, even as they were hauled off in captivity as young men. Well, now we see some time after that. They're in their younger adulthood, probably at about the age of 30, 35 at this point. And you can see that life of commitment to being obedient to God has gotten them elevated to positions of authority there in a foreign land, but it has also made them targets. It has also put them in a position where their life is threatened for their testimony, for their faith in God. Listen, the higher up the food chain you get, the older you get, the more mature you get, the more stuff you accumulate in life, the higher your position is on the job, the more relationships you have, and the more you value the relationships you have with people, the more opportunity there is to have your integrity compromised. Because it costs something to be identified with God as one of His people. It costs something to be a person of God. And that's what you're going to see as we walk through the text this morning. Today we'll see that God is sovereign even in putting His choicest servants' faith on display. One of the things we've seen in Daniel 1 and 2 is that as Daniel and his friends have been faithful to God, guess what He has done? He has acted in a marvelous way for them and to their benefit and blessed them and elevated them into positions of authority. What you're going to see here in Daniel chapter 3 is that having put them now into those positions of authority, He's really going to put their faith on display, and it's going to put them at risk of the loss of their lives. Being a child of God, being a servant of the Most High God, and in today's context, being a Christian is not about having your best life now. It's not about God blessing you and working all your circumstances out the way you want them, the way that you would like to have them. It is not about God making sure that everything goes right for you because you're doing things that are right. I don't know how many of you might have hung up in your closet at home that Batman cape. You're okay with everything when you do what's right and then things happen right. But what about when you do what's right and it goes badly for you? What about then? Then it's not right and it's time for me to take matters into my own hands. You know, the fact of the matter is that repeatedly throughout Scripture, throughout the whole of Scripture, what we see is many times God's people do what's right and they suffer for it. Whether you're talking about Genesis chapter 4 and Abel, the very first murder that ever takes place. Abel is murdered by his brother. Not because Abel did anything wrong, but because Abel did what was right and God accepted him for doing what was right, and Abel got upset at him and killed him for it. And you know something? God did not preserve Abel's life. Ever think of that? God let Cain murder his brother and then held Cain accountable for his actions. In Genesis chapter 5, the very next chapter, what we learn is that Enoch lives less than half as long as most of the people in his day. Why? Because he walked with God, and what the reward God had for him was he took him home early. I would say one of the things that's essential for us as Christians today to learn is that this life is not your life. This earthly circumstance is not what life is all about. This life is temporary. It is fleeting. This is a life that God is giving to you to live for Him in a sin-cursed and fallen world. If He gives you a long life, live it for Him, not for the stuff of life. If He takes you home early, then do your very best between now and the time you go to glory to live for Him. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are elevated to positions of high honor and authority and prestige and prominence and prosperity and wealth, they do not hesitate to demonstrate real great faith even at the risk of their lives. And I want you to see that as we walk through the text. 3 characteristics of great faith as it's displayed in Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or according to their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 3 characteristics of great faith on display in the text for us this morning. The first is that great faith is seen by others. Great faith is seen by others. Notice in verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, excuse me, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits, and he set it on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This is King Nebuchadnezzar, the same king that we saw who rolled into Jerusalem and subjected Jehoiakim to be a client king. The same king who took Daniel and his friends into captivity, into Babylon as a result of that conquest. The same king who had the dream. In fact, when he makes an image of gold, many have suggested, since the text doesn't actually tell you what the image is, many have suggested that the image of gold he made matched what he saw in his dream, and it wound up being an image of himself. You remember when he saw the image, that recurrent dream, Daniel says, the head of that image is you. And I don't think it's a far stretch to draw the conclusion that the king may well have made an image, made an image of himself and put it up on display. The text doesn't actually tell us, but he made an image and he required people to come and bow down to. The plain of Dura is one of the plains outside of the city of Babylon. It's still in the province of Babylon, but we're several miles outside the city at this point. A number of people who have debated as far as specifically where this is, but you're probably looking at somewhere between 5 and 10 miles outside the capital city. And he sets up this image of gold. It would have been an image made of either clay or stone or something along those lines, or perhaps even wood, and it would have been gold laid over top of that. So it's a golden image. The height is 60 cubits. You get out your slide rules, you can do a little math with me now. A cubit is basically about 18 inches. Okay, so 60 cubits is 90 feet. Now, just to give you a little perspective here, from the floor to the upper part of the ceiling is roughly 20 feet. Okay, so that's 4.5 times as tall as it is inside here. Okay, that's 90 feet. Pretty big statue, right? I should have looked it up since you guys just got back. How tall is the Washington Monument? Is that 89 feet? Is that right? Something like that? 89, isn't it? Way higher. 280 feet, okay? So it's about a third of the size of the Washington Monument. Are you going to go look that up now? Oh my goodness, stop it. All right, so anyway, so 90 feet. I even did all my homework on this, apparently not all of it. But anyways, that's about 20 feet to the ceiling. So it's about 4.5 times as tall as it is to the ceiling. That's a big image. Would you agree with that? A lot of people go, well, if this is an image of Nebuchadnezzar, then the proportions are all wrong. First of all, if you've ever done any research, ever looked at the internet at some of the images and paintings and drawings and statues and whatnot of Babylon, let's just say that Van Gogh may have gotten some of his ideas from them. Their proportions are typically not 100%. It may have been also that he put an image of himself up on top of a pedestal. And so it could have been, it's a 6 cubits at the base, right? And so you have 60 cubits high, so that's 90 feet high, and 6 cubits width. So the base is probably a 9 foot by 9 foot square, and then that will go up a number of cubits, probably about 30 feet up, and then the statue on top of that. Something along those lines. It's set up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So we're there in the home province. It's like being in Washington, D.C., but being just outside the outskirts of Washington, D.C. proper. It's part of the province, but not right in the city. And Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king set up. So when you talk about satraps and prefects and governors and counselors, what you're talking about is official positions in the royal administration, in the king's administration. Satraps refers to provincial heads. Prefects refers to the heads of unique groups, like Daniel being the head over the wise men, etc. There are others that are heads of other branches of government, like the military and whatnot. Governors seems to be some kind of regional heads underneath the satraps. Counselors refers to judges, so it could either be high-level administrators or high-ranking judicial officials, lawyers and such. Treasurers, judges, magistrates, or other high-ranking government officials, either in local or provincial or even, in some cases, military contexts. And then you have the catch-all at the end, all the rulers of the provinces. So all of the officials of the administration and the heads of state, if you got any kind of authority in the Babylonian government, you are summoned to this event. Again, these are for all of the outside provinces and for the province itself. So we're outside the city, but everybody with an administrative position basically outside the city, they all get summoned for this. And so then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So here's the picture. Everybody is assembled. It's one of those formal, official events out on the outside of the capital city. few miles from the capital, the king has built this monument to himself. That's what we see very clearly here in a moment. And he's got basically all the people that are part of his administration have come out to this monument for the unveiling of it. And then verse 4, the herald loudly proclaimed. A herald is an official person that has the ability to do what Katie told me this morning Mike apparently can't do, and that is go, people, 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 right? That long brow, that bold, proclaiming voice, the booming voice that draws everybody's attention. So the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language." And this is, again, men of every language. This is all of the people that have been captives from whatever land that through the time of Nebuchadnezzar's reign that he has conquered and brought into town and put through his formal education process in order to place them into administrative rules in his government. So whatever your native language is, I don't care. But you're all gathered, you've all been taught Aramaic, so you're all able to function in the language of the empire here. To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, okay, their government, their governors, and rulers in his empire, regardless of what nation they come from or what nation, client kingdom, etc., that they're overseeing for him. That at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. That's what's required. You are all, when this image is revealed, we're going to have the band or the orchestra, okay? We're going to have the band strike up, "Hail to Nebuchadnezzar." And when you hear my theme song and you see my image, you are going to bow down and worship the image. And by the way, I have a little enticement for you here, a little reward if you do that. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. So, extra bonus. You worship me and the image I've set up, and I don't burn you to death. Sound good? Now, that's announced when the implication of the text here is they get there to the plain of Dura, and that's the announcement. You didn't get a flyer that says, "Hey, come on out to the plain of Dura, and you get a chance to worship this image. You get to see the image I made for myself, and you get to worship me." No, you are all summoned and you all come. And when they get there, they're told, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to unveil this statue that I've made, this image I've made, and when the band strikes up and I stand there in all my pomp and circumstance, you're all going to bow down and worship." Why do you think that Nebuchadnezzar would do that? Some have argued that, well, he saw him, Daniel told him he's the golden head. Well, most likely, the text doesn't exactly tell us when this happened. Most likely this happened sometime around the time when Nebuchadnezzar, this is around 585 BC, a little bit after that perhaps, when Nebuchadnezzar has really subjugated all of the surrounding nations beneath his authority. Not that Jerusalem is all of that, but all of the surrounding nations are largely subjugated by the time you get to about 585 BC, maybe a little after that. It's at this point he feels really secure in his dominance of the region and his security over his empire. And he's been king now really since about 605. So he's got about 20 years in his reign, which makes, by the way, Daniel and his three friends roughly in their early to mid-30s. And they've been in authority now for over 10 years. And the herald loudly proclaims, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. The moment you hear the sound of the horn is probably an animal horn of some kind, maybe a trumpet, but probably a ram's horn or something like that would be hollowed out and the end cut off, and you blow through it, and kind of a summoning kind of a tone. The word flute is a word that basically means a whistle, some kind of a reed instrument. Lyre, trigon, and psaltery, those are all three stringed instruments. The lyre is like the stringed instrument that David played. The trigon is basically a three-sided harp. And the psaltery is another stringed instrument. It's a different shape of a harp. Bagpipes almost certainly were not bagpipes like what we think of with the Amazing Grace and the funeral tone. Most likely they were some kind of percussion instrument. And all kinds of music. That's either a reference to the music itself or to other instruments. So the picture here is essentially this. You got an assembly of all the high-ranking muckety-mucks and the low-ranking muckety-mucks from all of the conquered peoples and from all of the different administrations of the government of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar has had this image constructed for himself, whether it's his head or the whole of him or something along those lines, whatever. He's created this image, which almost certainly is reflective of himself. And he's got all of the people that work for him all there on the plain of Dura. And some estimates have this upwards of 1,000 to 1,500 people that are all gathered together out on the plain of Dura right there in front of this monument. And he's got the band there. And he's got his herald proclaiming, here's what's required. When we unveil this and the music starts to play, you all bow down and worship that image. And what are you demonstrating? You're demonstrating your loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar above all. I don't care what nation you come from. I don't care what God you worship or serve. You're allowed to do all that. But you will pledge your loyalty to me above all. You will demonstrate, you will prostrate yourself before this image I have set up, and you will worship this image and acknowledge that I am sovereign over you in all things. You are mine. This is a call for unity. This is not just the idea that he thinks he's a god. What he is literally providing is the means by which everybody can demonstrate their absolute total devotion to him above all others. I don't care what nation you're from, you're part of my empire, and you bow down and you affirm publicly your total commitment to me above all, regardless of who you are or where you're from. This is more than just a religious act. It's a political act as well. It's a matter of solidarity and commitment to the state and to the state's gods as much as it is to the king himself, who is the embodiment of the nation as its head. He has given all of these people power within his government, and now he expects them to demonstrate their absolute devotion and loyalty to him. You like your job? You like your wealth, your power, your prominence? Like the positions that I gave you? Great. This is your chance to publicly affirm that. Verse 7. Therefore at that time, when the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. They paid homage to it. They pledged their absolute allegiance and worship to the image, to the state, and to the king who stood at its head. 1,000 or more people out there on the plain of Dura bowing down. Imagine if it's one of the fields out here, maybe the field out here through the window you can see, right? It's out here. There's a big monument, 90 feet tall, set up out there. 1,500 people out there. The music sounds and everybody bows down. Here, everybody's dressed up in their formal attire too, by the way. You'll see that played out here in a moment when we move forward. You know, when people have formal attire and dresses and all of that stuff, and there's the bowing down, what do you hear? You can hear the rustle of the clothes, etc., right? Sure enough, that's what you have. Here it is. All the people just go down. When the peoples heard the sound of the music, The men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Notice in verse 8, it says, "For this reason at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews." For this reason, at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. You know what that implies? That implies that there were certain Chaldeans, and by the way, the word Chaldeans is a word that refers in this context to those who are native Babylonians, those who really are just from Babylon originally. They grew up here. They were raised here. And they almost certainly were sitting there watching as all this started to play out, watching to see what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would do. And you'll notice it says, they came forward, that is to the king, and they brought charges against the Jews. Certain Chaldeans, certain ones, some specific ones, brought charges against the Jews. And they responded and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, the king, saying in verse 9, "O king, live forever," typical court courtesy, like "Long live the king" or "Hail Caesar," whatever. "You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire." Well, there are certain Jews. Notice, not the Jews won't worship. There are what? Certain Jews. You know what you see about great faith right here? Great faith is seen by others. It's seen by others. The idea of verse 8 really is, for this reason, okay? Because there was going to be the call to worship this image that was set up, for this reason, right at that moment, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. And it's not against all Jews. It's against Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Why against just those three? Because there are certain Jews who will not bow down to a golden image, and they knew it. As soon as they hear this is what's going to be required, you know what they do? They are ready to jump on it. They're ready to tell the king about it. Oh, we got him. You also notice there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what that implies? Remember when we told you in Daniel chapter 1 that there were upwards of 60 to maybe even as many as 100 young men from Judah that were hauled into captivity? What happened to the rest of them? They graduated and they got positions in the government. And guess where they are? They're out here on the plains of Dura. And guess what they did when the music sounded? Well, the implication is here they bowed down just like everybody else did. But there's three who didn't. Why? Because the first thing that you'll see about great faith is it's seen by others. It's observable. There are certain Jews whom you've appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. They do not serve your gods. Listen, they've been working with them. They've been living with them. They've been interacting with them. They've been seeing them in their job. Many of them are almost certainly in subjection to them, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from a young age having been elevated nearly 20 years ago. Well, about 16 years ago, having been elevated to a position of authority over all of them. They knew as soon as that requirement was declared, there's no way those guys will bow down. And they watched. It's not the Jews won't do it. There are certain Jews who won't do it. They've disregarded you. They don't serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. That's the first great lesson for us from this text. Great faith is seen by others. not just in the immediate response when the trial happens, but by way of reputation even before that. You know, the kind of faith that you have in God is seen by your daughter, by your son. It's seen by your wife and by your husband. It's seen by your employer and your employees and by your fellow co-workers, by your friends, by your neighbors. The kind of faith, the kind of life of faith that you live is seen by the people around you on a daily basis. Your family, your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors. It's seen by those who are your friends and those who are your enemies. You ever had somebody that's really opposed to you, looking for any way they can find fault with you? And that one compromise of your integrity and something that comes out of your mouth or something that you do, and they go, oh, see, and you say you're a Christian. You ever feel the sting of that compromise of your own integrity as a Christian? Your faith is seen in the type of husband you are all day, every day. The type of father you are, the type of wife or mother you are, the type of son or daughter you are, the type of employer or employee that you are. It's not just seen in those big moments. It's seen all day, every day in the way that you conduct your life and your value system. The things you'll do and the things you won't do, and the reasons that you give that are clear as to why you won't do them. Listen, if you are a person who compromises in your integrity in order to get a deal or in order to get a raise or in order to save face, if you're the kind of person when you're wrong that you won't admit that you're wrong, you won't just step forward and assume responsibility for your mistake and say, you know what, that one's all mine. I was wrong, please forgive me, I messed that up. Yeah, but if you do that in this kind of a job environment, I won't have a job for very long and everybody will just start blaming me for everything. Let me ask you a question. Whose opinion do you really care about? Theirs or God's? The way you live your life in every single relationship, okay, demonstrates the kind of faith in God that you have or don't have. Do you want to know why when this command came out of the blue, when the music plays and we unveil this statue, you're all going to bow down and you're going to worship. You want to know why it is so instant and quick for listen, it isn't just that the only three guys standing are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These guys run up to the king right away and have to point it out to him. And they're ready to do so because as soon as they hear this is coming, they'll never do it. Do you have the kind of a Christian life that even if everybody else is breaking the law here, you just won't do it because it disobeys God? You know, everybody's doing it. At what point did that become the biblical standard for the way that we live our lives? If you're a Christian, it never has. It never has. Your commitment to Jesus Christ, I step forward and I publicly identify myself with Him as one of His through that first act of obedience, which is baptism. And I join the church because that's what He requires. And I function as a member of the body because that's what He has called each of us to do in our individual Christian lives. And I live a life of integrity in my home, in my marriage, with my kids. Do you know, when you have a little kid and you're trying to be obedient and teach them right and wrong and they do wrong, sometimes if they do wrong recurrently, you can get a little frustrated with them. Right? No? Just me? Okay. So, thanks for coming in for my personal counseling session. There are times in my life as a parent when I still remember a day, I've probably told this story before, but it's okay because Kath is homesick. So she won't know I used it again till it gets posted on the internet. But anyways, so my son disobeyed my wife half a dozen times in a 3-hour window one afternoon. And I confronted him, called him in, addressed it, we did the spanking, the whole bit, multiple times. Okay? Sent him back to do what's right. I was wrong. Please forgive me. Boom. And there was a hockey game on. And it was the playoffs. And I still remember I had no sooner sat down to watch it again than I heard him speak the same way to his mom yet again. And you gotta be kidding me. And I was so upset. I took him into the bathroom, and I was getting ready to spank him, and I was so mad at him, and I realized as I'm about to spank him, I'm just venting my rage and my frustration. I am not obeying God here. And I just dropped the spanker and said, I'll be back. And I went and prayed. I had to come back and ask for forgiveness. I asked my son for forgiveness for being angry with him instead of humbly addressing the issue. You want to know why? Because I compromised my integrity, and a person of integrity admits when they do that, and when they sin, they repent of their sin. You got to deal with your sin seriously. You got to deal with every decision you make, every word that comes from your life has to be characterized by integrity in every area of your life. Your words, your thoughts, your actions, the things you do and are committed to doing, the things you won't do. Where you draw the boundaries in your relationship. Listen, what matters to me is what God says, and my relationship to Him has to be supreme. All day, every day, and all the little things. You want to know why these people were sitting here, and when they heard that, they're like, oh, they're toast. And right away run up to tell the king, hey king, hey king, hey king. There are certain Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they disregard you. They won't worship or serve your gods. And they didn't obey your command. You need to throw them into the fiery furnace. Great faith is not only visible in the times of greatest trial and persecution, it defines who you are. And in these times of greatest, in these times when your faith gets put to the test at the greatest level, you want to know how they're able to stand in a context like that? Because their life is characterized by a commitment to be obedient, even in the small things, all the way up to this point. I'll tell you a little story. In the last 20 years, maybe more, at least the last 20 years, one of the most recurrent questions that I heard MacArthur ask in seminary chapels and in contexts where there were either a shepherd's conference or some situation like that, pastors and seminarians asking MacArthur, especially as people defaulted. The last one was Lawson, but when other TMS grads or other people that were famous preachers compromised their integrity with regard to immorality, I heard MacArthur asked repeatedly, Pastor John, what are you doing? What kind of accountabilities do you have in place so that doesn't become you? He says, accountabilities, what? You mean like, do I check in with my wife all the time? Or do I have elders that I'm calling and asking about this all the time? Listen, I'll tell you how I maintain my spiritual sanctification in this area and in all areas. I don't even let myself think those kinds of thoughts. I battle that with my eyes and my thoughts. I don't let myself start to think that kind of a thought. I turn away from it right away. Listen, when a guy falls to immorality, it's not like you wake up one day and go, oh, I think I'll commit adultery. Oh, I think I'm going to steal from the church. You don't wake up with that idea. You sear your conscience. You make those little compromises along the way so that by the time you get to that, like 2 Samuel 11 with David, he has a plurality of wives and a host of concubines. When he looks at another man's wife in 2 Samuel 11, have you noticed the context? In 2 Samuel 11, it's the time when kings go off to war. Where's David? He's in Jerusalem. It's the end of the day and he gets up out of his bed. What's he been doing all day? Sleeping. He set himself up for failure. You got a person of real integrity and godliness, you can see it. And you don't just see it When there's the threat of being thrown into the fiery furnace and great faith is on display and standing up to that kind of a challenge, you know how you see great faith on display all day, in every little decision, every little thought, every little deed, what you will do, what you won't do, and why you do it and why you won't do it. That's the first lesson. How do they stand up to the peer pressure of 1,000 to 1,500 people bowing down and them not being the only ones in the group that won't? Because long before then, their pattern was, I am absolutely committed to God. You see that in Daniel 1, do you not? They're 13 years old, hauled off into captivity, and following the example of Daniel. Because Daniel is clearly the leader in Daniel 1. Would you agree with that? They're following the example of a spiritual leader, basically their own age, but they're holding fast to the Word of God. By the time you get to about 20 years later, right here, Daniel isn't there. Now it's these guys on their own, right? Because their whole life up to this point has been characterized by, even in the smallest things, I will not compromise my integrity. So when this challenge comes up and it's at the risk of their lives, it's already a done deal for them. In fact, their enemies are expecting it. Second characteristic of great faith is that great faith is not only seen by others, but it's built on obedience. It's built on obedience. Notice in verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and anger gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then these men were brought before the king. What's that tell you? Listen, the king didn't notice it. This isn't something that was obvious to him. But it sure has him upset. That word rage is a word that speaks of furious anger, impassioned anger. And the word anger means literally to be cloudy. So we're talking about blinded by anger or rage when you put the two together. It's like when somebody talks about being so angry they couldn't see straight, or they're just seeing red. He had ordained this day and this event to be a great day in the history of His kingdom, a great dedication to His glory, and a great solidification of the kingdom under His rule, and all of those underneath His authority that He has raised up into positions of power and authority over His kingdom, acknowledging that He is their sovereign and their supreme in all things. And these three guys are standing apart from it? No. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Notice how Nebuchadnezzar knows them too, because he doesn't say that you've disregarded me. It doesn't say that you're not respecting me. I'd say this is an indication that he is familiar with them, and he's familiar with their service to him and their faithfulness. He also doesn't just fly off the handle and have them executed. He brings them forward to ask them, is this accusation true? Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, I'm going to strike up the band again. If you are willing, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image that I have made, and that actually, you notice in your English Bible it says very well, it's just kind of a ... in the original text. If you are ready, you can go ahead and we'll just call it all square and move on. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? That He would bring that statement up is what indicates to me He knows who the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is. And He has not forgotten what his experiences were 15, 20 years ago with Daniel. You remember what he said about Daniel's God? You remember what he said? In Daniel 2, verse 46, when Daniel reveals the dream and its interpretation, We're told that King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, paid homage to Daniel, gave orders to present to him an offering and a fragrant incense. And the king answered Daniel, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." People ask, is he a believer at that point? Answer, no. All he's acknowledging is that the chief God of all gods is Daniel's God. What he says here to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is, what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? He might be bigger than all other gods, but he can't save you from me. Incidentally, many commentators have observed the fact that the furnace has to be in the immediate vicinity because they're almost at once cast into it. And what is this fiery furnace? Well, I spent a little time, Mike can attest to this, I spent a little time doing some research on this. This is almost certainly an ancient brick kiln, or a furnace used to bake bricks to make them hard. I even spent a lot of time seeing about making bricks and how you go through that whole process, painstaking process. Basically, you get a mold and some mud. You throw the mud into the mold. You throw out of the mold down onto the ground, and you let it dry. But if you work it at all, it just crumbles. Kids ever play in the mud and make something out of it, and then the sun dries it out, and you pick it up and you can just squeeze it and crumble it into dust, right, into dirt. So what do you do to make bricks? You take those bricks and you let it dry all the way through, and then you put them in an oven. And what's really interesting is that you have to put it into an oven that you can, to an extent, control the temperature, because you can't just raise it up to a super high temperature, because if you superheat them rapidly, bricks actually explode, and then you have shrapnel, which is typically bad unless you were planning on not living through the experience. Okay? And so what they did was they would build a kind of a dome. Or they would carve into a hillside and then put bricks around the outside and have a kind of a dome structure. And some of the larger brick kilns that were constructed in those days would have been basically a dome structure, maybe carved into a hillside. And I measured it out. It's about the size of the side room here, with the roof of it being about where the roof is on the side room. So you're looking at anywhere from 12 to 15, maybe as high as 20 feet tall. Okay? And there would be a door in the front, and then it would be all solid walls around. And the reason that you have all of that covering around that oven is to keep the heat in, and there would be a hole in the top. And that hole would be for the smoke to get out. And then you bring all the bricks in there and you lay them out on the floor, and then you start a roaring fire in there, and you keep heating that fire until they literally bake the bricks into solid brick-like material. So most likely the spot was selected. Some have argued that he built this oven specifically for this occasion. I would say it's more likely that he built the statue in the neighborhood of where this brick kiln would be, but that's almost certainly the kind of fiery furnace we're talking about. And so he says, listen, we're going to have the music play again, and you're going to bow down and worship. And if you don't, you will immediately be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? And I want you to notice how immediate the response is from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why? Because they have a life pattern of obedience, of commitment to God. So regardless of what the threat is, they're going to be obedient. They have preconditioned themselves to be able to stand up to this greatest of all threats because their life has been characterized by obedience up to this point. They have chosen God in the little things. When the big thing comes along, it's easy. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer concerning this matter." A couple of commentators have said that's a snarky way to respond. It's not. When you translate this from the original, it literally says we don't have to give you a verdict or a decision. In other words, we don't have to deliberate on this. We don't have to think about it. Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to think concerning what answer we're going to give to you on this matter. If it be our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image you've set up. We don't have to think through this. We don't need any time to deliberate. If it be our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And commentators get into a discussion of whether this is them saying, if it be our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, meaning they expect a miracle. And some take it that way. And you can translate it that way, but if you look at the next verse, but if not means what? Not if he can't rescue us, but if he doesn't. What's that mean that verse 17 says then? Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And if it be, in other words, if God intends to work it out this way, he is able to deliver us. It's not them saying there's going to be a miracle. It's them saying, yes, God could do a miracle. If it be that God would choose to do that, he is able to deliver us from your hand. It's not a statement of fact, but of faith. Our God is able to deliver us from your hand. But if it's not going to be that way, if this is not the way that he has chosen to orchestrate the events in our lives at this point, then let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They're committed to obeying God, even though it's almost certainly going to cost them their life. Are you? Are you committed to God no matter what relationship it costs you? No matter what promotion it costs you? No matter what it costs you and other people's thinking about you? I really like the way that the life pattern of obedience is so clearly on display here for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't have to give you an answer concerning this. In other words, we don't have to deliberate on this to figure out what we're going to say. Listen, if it be our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and then he will deliver us out of your hand. But even if not, let it be known to you, O king, we will not disobey him, no matter what it costs us, even up to our life. Verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath. You know what that means? Oh, he was mad. And his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what that means? It was written all over his face. His facial expression was so mad. It's like, it's that squished face, the red face, that steaming, mad anger. And he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. You know, you have to get bricks, first of all, if I remember right, up to about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And then beyond that, if I recall, to really bake them. But it has to be a progression, right? 7 times. And I think 7 times just means heating it to the maximum it could be heated. And you can see that's actually what happens. Nebuchadnezzar gives orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than usual, and he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Valiant warriors means strong, powerful, probably his personal guard. And remember, he's a king that has been leading the army, and so these are probably like his gunnery sergeants, his biggest, strongest, toughest guys. The guys that have been with him in the tightest battles. And so these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their clothes, and they were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. So again, we'll just, sorry to the Farrells, but you guys are all on fire now. Okay, so that's the furnace, and you just figure there's a pathway up here, and you go up to the top, and you're going to cast them down into the fiery furnace. So you're going to drop about 10, 15 feet down inside the furnace, and it's all flaming right there. And there's a doorway open in front here so that you can see in. Normally that would be shut once you're doing the baking of the bricks. And that's how you can be to the outside and look in, and how they get thrown into it. Tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes. Why even mention this? Because they're still in their formal attire. They're still in their fancy clothes, their fancy robes, and their caps, and their garments, and the whole bit. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what that means? Those veteran, valiant warriors, strongest of men, who haul up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and get up to the opening in the top of the furnace. When they get in there, there'll be flames coming out of there. The superheated the way it was. They throw them down in there, all tied up, and the flames are so hot it literally melts the soldiers. They collapse right there, dead on the spot. It's so hot. You know what that confirms? On so many levels, the absolute certainty of a miracle here. The guys that threw him in died just getting close to the flames, never mind being tossed into the furnace. The flames slew those men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, tied up. I want you to notice something about their faith. Their faith did not prevent them from having to be singled out and called up before the king. Their faith did not prevent them from being challenged in front of everybody and being forced to say, no, we're going to stay faithful to the king. Their faith did not prevent them from being tied up or hauled up onto the top of the oven, or even cast in and dropped 10 to 15 feet down into the oven. Their faith did not preserve them from any of those experiences. And yet nowhere do you see a complaint from any of them, or a recanting from any of them. Their faith is so great they're willing to die rather than disobey God. This isn't the first time they've trusted and obeyed God. And by God's grace, it won't be the last. You notice, by the way, that when they stood before the king, and as they're being hauled by his soldiers up to the furnace to be thrown in, there's not a single appeal they make to Daniel. Well, king, but we're friends of Daniel. Nope. Their faith is built on obedience to God. What's the last characteristic of great faith? Great faith is honored by God. Great faith is seen by others, it's built upon obedience, and it's honored by God. Notice in verse 24. Great faith is honored by God. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded, and he stood up in haste. He pops up out of his seat, and he says to his high officials, was it not 3 men we cast into the midst of the fire? And they replied to the king, certainly, O king. And he said, well, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of God's. It's an angelic being. And Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. Now, notice this is the door on the front. Okay? This isn't the top where they were thrown in. He goes near the door. He doesn't go to the door. He can't. It's superheated. Near to the door. And he yells in, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God. Oh, the Most High God is back. And come here. Notice Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men, one, that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. No sunburn, no blisters, no harm done to them whatsoever. Two, nor was the hair of their head singed. Ever light a grill? Ever try to light a grill? Like the lighters on my grill's got to be 20 years old. And so the auto light thing on the grill hasn't worked for probably 19 years. And so we've been using one of those long snout little lighters things, right? Well, not that I have experienced this in the past, but hypothetically speaking, you could go out sometimes, especially in the January to March time frame when it's windy and it's cold and it's wet. And you do you turn on the gas and you do the click, 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 and once in a while there's a spark and you're like, you've got to be kidding me, right? And you're there shivering because you're like an idiot. You wore a t-shirt instead of a sweatshirt and you're at click, 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 and the longer it clicks and then you pull it out and you look at it, maybe, and then you go and you click and then what happens? Whoosh, right? And you burn the hair off the back of your knuckles, right? And when you're walking into the house and you go to, just rub your nose a little bit or whatever, what do you smell? Burnt hair, right? And the smell of smoke. Even if you don't do that, when you're out at the grill, when you come into the house with the steaks, what do you smell like? Smoke. Ever go camping? What do you smell like? You don't smell like the woods, you smell like the campfire, right? I want you to notice here, verse 27, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been thrown into a fiery furnace that was so hot, that the guys that threw them in instantly died. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around in the front together with the king. And they saw in regard to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they walked out. Notice there's no reference to the ropes. What happened to the ropes? They burned up. But the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Number two, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers in any way damaged. They didn't even actually, when they fell in, they don't even actually scuff their knee or rip their pants. Nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. How does that happen? God. The only thing that's burned up is the ropes. And Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Notice, they violated you. Blessed be your God and you, because you disobeyed me in order to not disobey your God, because your God is the Most High God. He sent his angel and delivered his servants because you put your trust in him. Now, the angel, was it an angel? Was it the pre-incarnate Christ? The text doesn't actually tell us. The text does tell us later on that it's an angel that shows up to give revelation to Daniel. So it's very reasonable to conclude this is an angel. Most, I think, actually do land there. I think it's also quite reasonable to conclude that when God's choicest servants were thrown into the fiery furnace, he went right in there with them. You can't draw that conclusion because it says Son of God. But I think you can draw that conclusion on the basis of the fact that the one who came to the aid of his people, either sending an angel or personally coming, perfectly preserved them. And so Nebuchadnezzar's response in verse 29, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be, here's Chuck and Gina's favorite expression in Daniel, they shall be torn limb from limb and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. You know what he just said? Same thing he said back the last time with regard to the wise men. You speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you will be dismembered and your house will be turned into a dunghill. Pretty serious, right? I think God has gotten Nebuchadnezzar's attention. Is Nebuchadnezzar a believer? Come back next week. In the meantime, notice verse 30, then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Because they stood for God, God raised them up even more. Listen, I'm not telling you that if you obey God, if you trust God, if you take a stand for God at your work or in your home or with your extended family or in your neighborhood or with your associates or at the gym or wherever else, I'm not telling you that life is going to go better for you. I'm not telling you that God is going to work a miracle for you. What I'm telling you is that God is going to put your faith on display if you're one of His. And you have two choices. You can either think about it and get yourself into a process, is it really worth obeying here? Or you can make a commitment to really be a person of great faith that is seen by others, that is founded in obedience, and ultimately winds up being rewarded by God with a closer and a more intimate relationship with Him and with a life that continues to be a testimony to Him. That's your choice. What's your Christian life like? Is it a life characterized by all the little choices add up to real conviction and a real commitment to be identified with the God who saved me, the God who loves me, to be identified with Him in baptism, to be identified with Him not just at the beginning of my Christian life, but all day, every day of my Christian life, to be identified with Him as one of His people and a member of His church, to be identified with Him and my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, to live the kind of a life that becomes an encouragement and a conviction to the people around me. To live the kind of a life that when things happen in society, that people look at you and they fully expect you to do this because you're so committed to Christ. Even if they're not quite ready to do that themselves, and your life becomes an example for others to follow. I spent a lot of time growing up under the ministry of John MacArthur and my host of exemplary spiritual fathers. And you guys have regularly experienced that sense of seeing the things that are happening in our world, especially over the last 5 years, and looking forward to hearing what MacArthur would have to say, because he's always going to say what the Bible says, right? Okay, you know what? There's only one John MacArthur, but there's also only one you. Is your life the kind of a Christian life that others just expect you to behave in a way that glorifies God? That your integrity is so secure and so sound, your commitment and conviction to Christ is so sure that people just, not only would they not believe this is true of you, but when something happens, they could predict your absolute total commitment to Christ. Well, that's the way that he's going to respond. That's the way she's going to respond. You know, the people with the closest relationships with God and that know the nearness of God the best are the people that are characterized by this kind of great faith. A faith that is seen by others, a faith that is founded on obedience, and a faith that is honored by God. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the many ways you blessed us, for the richness of your word, and for the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. May we be men and women of faith like Daniel and his 3 friends, who really are committed to you and to your word and are willing to live even in a sin-cursed, fallen, secular environment, lives dedicated to you. In Christ's name, amen.